Thank you, Moo. Hello, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be with you today. I am joining you from Broken Hill. That's Wilyakali land, and I pay my respects to elders past and present, and also to any First Nations people on the line with us today. And thank you, Charlene, for that beautiful acknowledgement of country that we had at the beginning of this session. I'd also like to add my thanks to Muslim Women Australia for developing this fantastic guide and for organising this event today. We've had a really great collaboration ever since I first started in February this year. I've really appreciated and enjoyed all of the collaboration that we've had. So thank you very much for that, especially Maha and Nemat. And I hope that that continues in the coming months and years, as I'm sure it will. I don't want to spend too long on introductory comments because we have a great panel with us here today, 4 panellists. I would like to start by going around to each of the panellists and asking them to introduce themselves and giving each panelist some high-level just opening remarks. And then I'll take you through a bit of a Q&A session where we can go into some of the issues in more detail. So starting with you, Annabelle.
Thanks very much, Hannah, and it's wonderful to be here. I'm coming from Gadigal land today, and so I pay my respects to elders past and present and to any Aboriginal and First Nations people on the line. My name's Annabelle Daniel. I'm the Chief Executive of Women's Community Shelters, which is an organisation that works with local communities around New South Wales to establish and open new crisis and transitional housing for women and kids. I also have the privilege of being the chair of the peak body for domestic and family violence services in New South Wales, Domestic Violence New South Wales, and I'm on the Coercive Control Implementation Task Force for New South Wales, and also chairing the Domestic and Family Violence Sector Reference Group there and the Lived Expertise Reference Group, and very excited to be here today and by this amazing resource that's been put together by Muslim Women Australia.
Thank you very much, Annabelle. Over to you, Britt.
Thanks, Hannah. Hi, everyone. My name's Britt. I'm joining from unceded Wurundjeri land here in Melbourne. So I want to acknowledge the elders past and present and any Indigenous people who are here with us today. I'm the Acting Head of Engagement at No to Violence. We're the largest peak body in Australia, and we represent individuals and organisations who work with men to address domestic and family violence. And thank you so much to Muslim Women Australia for having me today.
Nemat, over to you.
Hi everyone, thank you Hannah. I'm coming to you all from Bidjigal country. My name is Nemat and I manage the Linking Hearts Multicultural Family Violence service at Muslim Women Australia. I'm also proud to be a colleague on the board of DV New South Wales with Annabelle, and I'm really excited to really have an authentic conversation around what this project has taken and how we can really embed specialist responses and whole of community approaches to supporting women's safety in a way that's inclusive of men. So thank you.
Thanks, Nemat. And last but not least, Ghaith.
Thank you, Hannah. I'm Ghaith. I'm also coming to you from Wurundjeri land, and I want to extend my acknowledgement to elders past, present, emerging, and who may still be with us on this as well. I'm the project lead for Saving Face. I've lived and breathed this for the last, specifically for this project, for the last 3 years or so, but the conversations Maha and I have had around the role of men go way back before that, and I actually reminded Maha I came across a project brief that she and I put together back in 2017 for the New South Wales government on a project around elderly men working with young men within the Muslim community, so ways in which we can engage. And I actually want to thank DSS, our funder, because when they approved this project, it was actually quite a risky decision, I thought, for them to approve a project which was so faith-focused in an environment where faith is not that sexy a thing, let's be honest about it, yeah? So it was really good that government saw the opportunity there, and it's fantastic that we're here today to see part of the outcome. I mean, the guide is only one of the outcomes of the whole project, but from a sector perspective, it's a really fantastic opportunity for us to look at different ways moving forward. we all know what the problem is. We all share and understand what the problem is, but solutions are myriad. They're as diverse as the people that we have within the community. And, you know, just to give you a sense of how diverse our own community is, in the 2016 census, so there are currently 195 recognised nation states across the world. In the 2016 census, the Australian Muslim community was drawn from 183 of those countries. So faith is what unites those 183 different cultures. And it's the door to open the way into change amongst those 183 different cultures. That's really what we're talking about today. So I'm looking forward to the conversation and any questions that might come up.
Thank you very much, Ghaith. I'd now like to go around the panel with some questions related to the sector to share your thoughts and reflections. The first theme I'd like to explore is this idea of whole of community approaches, which is such an important theme that comes through the sector guide. What does an authentic whole of community approach look like to you from your experience? Let me start with you, Britt.
I think that an authentic approach really does look at everyone in the community. I guess that's why it's called a whole of community approach. We know that we need buy-in from all levels. So we know that we need government, health, we need community members, and everyone taking that consistent approach. We need not to just establish approaches, but to reinforce them and embed them into value systems. In my experience in the LGBTIQA+ sector, who are traditionally excluded from mainstream family violence services, really looked at creative and innovative responses to family violence that look at the whole community and how we can build on that to address family violence, but also prevent it for current and future generations. So I think we can take a lot of learnings from communities and how they have been able to really adapt and innovate new ideas.
Mm-hmm. I might take this over to you, Nemat. I know you've worked a lot on the guide specifically. What are your thoughts on an authentic whole of community approach?
Thanks, Hannah. I have so many thoughts. I'm going to try and be succinct, but I agree with what Britt's saying. As in, there's got to be consistent strengths-based approaches that allow for those those difficult conversations, and also allow for maybe areas where it does look different in different communities. I think what's so powerful about not just this guide, but the framework that it establishes, and is that it's so evidence-based. It's evidence-based in the fact that it's backed by the Baulch framework. It's evidence-based in that it's backed by models, research-based in the UK and in Australia that sort of provide a framework for what we know. But what it does is sort of allows it not to just be top down, but it allows it to sort of be ground up as well. And I think that's that beautiful balance point that we need to strike, so that we actually provide some thought leadership and leadership in action as well around how do we then engage, because while we need to bring all communities along, and we need to do that in a really effective way, we need to do that in a way which doesn't undermine the women who've raised their voices in this space to do that. And so I think it's a delicate approach to and it's an approach that, while we now all use the language of co-design and whole of community approaches and specialization, it wasn't always that way. It was a time where MWA was engaging in the space and saying men are part of the solution. We work in a complementary way. To not work in that way actually creates more harm for women in accessing safety or seeking help. And the fact that we've now come to a point where we can have that conversation in that way is really important. But as was rightfully said, it's not enough to just establish it. We need to embed it, we need to build on it, and we all have a role to play in how we do that. But it needs to be authentic, there needs to be trust, there needs to be respect, and even within our own community and our own organisation, who has so much trust and credibility in this space, we also had some challenges in that, and I know Ghaith can speak to that a lot better than I. So that's a little bit from my perspective.
Well, that's a good segue, perhaps straight over to you then, Ghaith.
Thanks. I guess a couple of points. In the guide itself, we actually spend a fair amount talking about leadership, because we know the issue of control is one of the biggest drivers around violence, and we present to the sector, but also in terms of our own community, concepts of prophetic leadership, and we draw this very important distinction between consultation and collaboration, and we're trying to drive the men within our own community to take a collaborative approach around leadership. And I guess the message is, as a sector, we need to shift to collaboration rather than consultation, because collaboration really says, I'm actually interested in your ideas about what the problem is, not just your ideas about my solution to the problem. So we need to go way upstream when we're thinking about how we work together, and not just from a perspective of, well, here's a problem, here's what I think we should do, give me your views about that. Because straight away, that's narrowing the possible solutions, right? So we need to broaden our approach to all of those things. And you know, we all need to acknowledge that we have these unconscious biases, because it happened to me. So in this actual project itself, you know, I had thoughts around what I thought our community thought on these issues, which when I ran focus groups proved to be not completely wrong, but wrong in some really important aspects. So even on my own community, my own biases come into play, right? So we've got to take a step back and remember that we all bring our experiences and and all these sort of stuff into play in this space. And we do that at individual level, we do it institutional level, and at an organisational level. And I guess that's a big part of what the guide's really talking about, right? Just taking that step back and acknowledging that there's a contribution that's important by people from a whole range of different ways. And how do we build ways of working together where we respect but also leverage off all of those things? I think that's the real challenge for us.
I'm going to come back to you, Ghaith and Nemat, in just a moment, because I know how deeply involved you were in this project. But first of all, Annabelle, over to you for your reflections on authentic whole of community response or approach.
Well, yeah, thank you, Hannah. I don't think there could be a more authentic community response than what Muslim Women Australia has produced here. And it would be remiss of me not to mention, as chair of the peak body, that they were a founding member of DV New South Wales and also have been deeply embedded in specialist expertise and specialist responses for decades. And it's also so beautiful to see it come to this point where the work like Saving Face is recognised, celebrated and deemed important, because in some of the earlier days in domestic and family violence, Muslim Women Australia actually experienced pushback for working with men. And, you know, and it is so important to say, this is important work for us to do. We do have to embrace a whole of community approach. And what's more, we will do whatever it takes to get the solutions to this wicked problem. And so building a strong evidence-based framework to make that happen, to engage whole of community approaches, you know, my huge congratulations for this important piece of work. And certainly from what I see, I think Nemat summed it up beautifully when she said, you know, top down can only get us so far. We have to come in from the grassroots, work with communities, listen to all kinds of different points of view and build the solutions in collaboration together to make something happen. That is the only way we're going to shift the needle on the issue of domestic and family violence, because if domestic and family violence was an easy problem to solve, we would have solved it by now. It takes hard work, it takes conversation by conversation, it takes boots on the ground, and it takes really meeting people where they are, moving the needle and changing their hearts and minds person by person in order to affect the change that we want to see in Australia.
Thanks, Annabelle. I'd like to come back to you, Nemat. I know we've talked a lot about Muslim Women Australia's fantastic work with the Muslim community, but that's not your only focus. Your work is relevant more generally to everyone. And I'd like you just to explore that a little bit. What's distinctive about your approach to prevention in faith and minority communities, and what is applicable more generally? If you could just delve into that a little bit, that'd be great.
Yeah, thanks, Hannah, and thanks, Annabelle, for summarising that so beautifully. I think, you know, what I'm really passionate about with our work at MWA is that it's not a theoretical approach. This is embedded in practice. This is embedded in lived experience. And when we're talking about lived experience voices, we're committed to doing that in an ethical way that enhances outcomes, that enhances people's well-being, that enhances their agency and their autonomy and their dignity. So while we provide a multicultural service for domestic and family violence that grew out of the first ever Muslim Women's Refuge that used to exist in Australia, we're very proud to be able to look at victim survivors' experiences from a really intersectional way, a way that is client-centered, is trauma-informed. But what it does is it does not take a tick the box approach to cultural competency. When we enhance women's agency, and why I'm talking about women in this space before I talk about men is because that's exactly where this project grew out of. It grew out of working with victim survivors and continues to work with victim survivors. It grew out of understanding that, as Ghaith rightly said, power and control cuts across all cultures, all faiths, all languages, and all communities. And so what we actually saw in women's help-seeking behaviour was what they actually experience is this double bind when they're in a minority community, this double bind of wanting to seek help but not wanting to stigmatise and stereotype their communities. So it does feed into that safety framework and that cultural safety framework. But when we talk about cultural safety, it's not just what cultural background did you come from and which visa did you come from and how did your parents migrate. It's well beyond that. It's reframing that conversation to understanding culture, language to access services, but also what are the values that that person brings? What is their spiritual framework that can bring? And how does that tie into their spiritual activism? Because when we look at victim survivors' experiences as a family, holistically and collectively, not just individualistically in our model, that's the model that we provide, what we then do is take those learnings and work back. So we look at the woman in her own right. We look at her children as victims in their own right. We acknowledge that boys aged 12 to 17 in this area have very little culturally appropriate support services. And then we work backwards and we say, what have we learned from that practice experience to enhance men's responses to working with their communities in a proactive sense? And so that's what I'm really passionate about MWA's work in this space, that it's developed a primary response and a primary infrastructure working from practice, not working in theory.
Thank you. I'd like to take this a bit further with you, Ghaith. You've worked on this for such a long time. What is distinctive about the approach to prevention, specifically in faith communities? What is it that this guide adds in relation to leveraging the faith aspect of the discussion?
I think, Hannah, that at the heart of it is a recognition that each faith community, or regardless of whether it's a faith community or another community that's identified, you identify with a set of values and a set of morals. And if you want people to behave in a particular way or to change their behaviour, you've got to present that in a way that resonates for them without challenging their core beliefs. And so what this guide does, it presents how we did that for the Muslim community, or how we're proposing it happens for the Muslim community, that there is within the value framework of that community the essence for a response to this problem, that we don't have to challenge their values to give them the tools and the language and the artifacts to actually find solutions for themselves. Because one of the big issues our community in particular has, particularly men within our community, is, and we talk about intersectionality a lot, but for us, it's not a theoretical concept, right? Myself, I actually come from a very privileged background within my community. So I have to acknowledge I have a very privileged position. I don't, and I haven't suffered the same issues of racism and discrimination that a lot of younger men in my community have. But the reality is, I'm a man working in the DV sector. I'm a brown man working in the DV sector. I'm a brown man of faith, and I'm a brown man of the Muslim faith. All of those things out in the broader society, layer upon layer of people who would form views about me without even knowing me or even saying a word about what I am. Our young men suffer from this every single day. And so there is a huge issue of trust or mistrust of anything that is presented to them that they perceive as wanting to change who they are. So if we can come from a position that says, you know what, we actually not only do we acknowledge who you are, but we actually value who you are as being part of the solution to this. Straight away, you get a very different outcome. You know, one of the biggest challenges I had from a project perspective was actually getting men to come to the workshops. But when they come, the outcome's phenomenal. And so they go back to their community saying, no, it's not what you thought it was, right? You know, the testimonials that you told earlier, one was from a Perth workshop, one was from the Victorian workshop, right? And it's so hard to get people to come, but their eyes just open because they realise that actually we're not challenging them, we're actually empowering them to use their own faith within their communities, but also to be more comfortable having the conversations with the more general public, right? So I think it's just giving them that sense of returning some sense of value and worth into the values that they hold dear to themselves.
That's so powerful. Thank you for that, Ghaith. We've talked a lot about engaging directly with the community. That I like how Nemat put it, that it can't be a top-down approach. It really needs to be bottom-up as well. Britt, I'd like to turn to you. What are some of the challenges for the sector engaging with the community, particularly at that grassroots level, and really reaching the community with these messages?
Yeah, I think that there are a lot of challenges. I think that the sector really lacks the tools and resources to be able to do that effectively. I think there's a real challenge with government adequately resourcing the sector to do that work as well. And we're finding that consultation occurs rather than true co-design. And I think we really need to begin to shift away from that, because I think collaboration is really important when it comes to collaborating with communities to develop innovative and effective responses. We often take a one-size-fits-all approach that we know isn't working. We know that the rates of women murdered by family violence are just going up. So we really need to be taking creative approaches to addressing this issue. I do think that there may be some resistance. We often know that the family violence sector will sometimes take that expert approach when it comes to working with communities, and we can't apply an approach. We need to be developing approaches together. We need to be getting that buy-in. In therapeutic practice, we talk about the concept of the violence of knowing. And that's when we assume to know someone's experiences. We assume to know what they've been through, and we may treat groups and communities as homogenous beings. And we can't do that in this work. We need to be creating tailored responses to what is actually a really complex issue.
Hannah,
Yeah, I was going to hand over to you.
Yeah, if I could just have something that Britt just mentioned there around expertise. Yeah. I think it's really important, and I would hope this would come through the guide, that we don't discount expertise from the sector. In fact, it's critical to the contents of the guide. What the guide says is you can't communicate that expertise, though, in the same way. So let's take that expertise and find the language and the communication channels that are most appropriate for a particular community so we can get that message across, right? And that was why it's really important for us when we're doing that work to do that mapping exercise back against the Our Watch action statements, so that the sector itself could see that we're not actually going against the expertise of the sector. We're actually utilising that very expertise, but in a way that's actually going to get real on-the-ground change in this community.
I might turn to you, Annabelle, continuing this discussion about engaging with the community and what are the challenges for the sector. You've talked about this a bit already. If you'd like to just explore that a bit further, or also address the issue of what are the challenges for the community engaging in with the sector. So what are the barriers in the other direction as well?
Yeah, look, and I think those are really interesting questions, Hannah. I'd certainly say that, you know, if I was to say one of the challenges for the sector, it's that historically and even currently, a lot of the way that funding is done on a service delivery approach rather than a capacity building approach. And we actually need to take capacity building approaches if we are going to change the hearts and minds of community on the issues of domestic and family violence. And fundamentally, that's much riskier. It's a little bit more difficult to measure in terms of raw outcomes. You know, you haven't got output numbers to show somebody, but it is the work that yields results. You just can't always see it in the short term. And that's why taking the time it takes to develop these kinds of responses and doing the work that we do on the ground is so incredibly important. And I actually think that, and I would be surprised if Ghaith, in working with communities, you wouldn't find the same thing, which is the case that communities actually want to get involved. They want to have resources. They want to know how they can shift the needle on these things. And if you can provide the channel for people to contribute and to be part of the response, they're knocking the door down, because they see the same headlines that we do in the sector. They see the front page of the paper. They see it's horrific that women and children are dying and being assaulted in numbers. Everybody wants to do something to solve the problem, but when it's a huge problem that feels too big for any one person to be part of the solution, then it's too easy to put aside and say, oh, that's for somebody else. But when you bring something to a community at the local level and say, this is how you can be a part of the solution, this is how you can talk to your network, this is how you can talk to your family, this is how you can talk to your faith community or your service club, those are the ways that we can open those channels, and we see the wealth of goodwill that comes in when we do that. So I actually think that there's probably less barriers from the community side wanting to be part of the solution than we might think there are. We just have to access it in clever ways.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Annabelle. I'd like to pick up on something you just said about the importance of capacity building. In relation to prevention work specifically, I might turn to you, Nemat. What is the importance of capacity building in prevention work?
Capacity building in prevention work, for me, it's everything that there is to do, because and I'd like to sort of address this question from a different perspective, and I want to agree with Annabelle completely. It's about changing the framework in which we actually apply it. It's about having if we want to end violence in a generation, which we all agree to, then we need to take an approach that does factor in a long-term approach, that you know, we need to build fences, build bridges and not build fences around some of these issues. And so Moo, you mentioned that, I wrote it down, I think you mentioned or Maha might have mentioned, around being a compass, and that's what we want this guide to be. We want this guide to be a compass. If you give somebody a map of Sydney, they're only going to know how to navigate Sydney. But if you give somebody a compass, they've got the skills to draw their own map no matter where they are in the world. And so this guide is not just to be, you know, something that sits on the shelf or sits on a digital platform. We actually want it to empower and encourage all of us to be agents of change no matter where we go. So in terms of capacity building, there's a huge especially within the prevention space, there's so much that we need to do, and we need to think long term. We don't need to think short term, because transformative engagement, it does take a walking with and an immersion. It's not about cultural competence or cultural training or faith-centric training. It's about being immersed in this journey together. And I think what this guide and what this project represents is MWA's walking of that journey for the last 4 decades. And that's because of that support and that collaboration and working together that we've been able to have the space to articulate it in this way. Because when we're talking about the history of the sector in the space, we also have to call it out. There has been a lack of the sector wanting to also acknowledge faith in and the role that faith can play within the sector, because there are rightful, legitimate concerns about what that has looked like in the past for different communities and different faith communities. But we need to grow and move beyond that. And we've got the skills and the partnerships to do that in a much more fruitful and effective way. I think it's also important because when we look around, if we look at just what we know about the dynamics of domestic and family violence, around the dynamics of disclosure, sometimes a real challenge from not just the sector, but from government as well, is that it needs to be within the reach of government. It needs to be within the fingertips of that. And that can be a limiting approach, because even though it's safe, what I'm trying to say here is, you know, in terms of building, when the data says around women's help-seeking behaviour, that they will reach into their social response, like they will seek social responses to their help-seeking before they will seek formal responses. And so we need to take that learning from what we know the evidence says. We need to build capacity in terms of response, but also in terms of prevention. And we need to do that in a way which amplifies expertise and doesn't take away from that process. So yeah, I think there's a huge role for capacity building and the way that we do that across each stage of the service continuum.
Thanks, Nemat, and this guide's a great contribution in that regard. And just on what you just said, many of you online will realise this, but the recent personal safety survey of the Australian Bureau of Statistics did show that many victim survivors of domestic family violence seek support from informal networks, very high percentage rather than formal networks. So it's really hit the nail on the head what you just said, Nemat. Another theme that comes through this guide, and something I'd like to explore, is the notion of male identity. Perhaps I'll turn to you first, Ghaith, because I know you've worked a lot on this issue and you were involved directly in many of the workshops with men that led to this guide. Why is it important for the sector to be cognizant of male perceptions of identity?
I think that the thing that we're all aware of is broadly across society at the moment, there is a growing backlash amongst certain cohorts of men around a range of issues. And this issue of, broadly speaking, feminism is one of them. That's happening broadly across society. And although I don't have direct evidence, anecdotally, I think it's causing an issue for us within this sector in terms of the willingness of young men in particular to listen to some of the messages and to take on board what is being said. Now, if that's happening broadly across society, when you then overlay the intersectionality issues that I spoke about earlier, it becomes a far greater issue for certain communities because they're being challenged around their identity as men regardless. And for some communities, and certainly for our faith community, a big part of the response to this issue of domestic family violence is around their role as men. So they're being challenged in broad society around their role as men more broadly, and we're coming from this side challenging their understanding of what their role of men is from a faith perspective, and they're saying, well, who am I? Right? Really, what is my role in society? Because over here you're telling me it's not this, you're now telling me it's not. What is it? Right? So this issue of helping men understand what their role, what their identity really is, and where their sense of value and worth comes from is important. And from our community perspective, it's very fundamental because it's one of the areas where there's a difference around how we perceive certain issues. So if we don't confront that issue of what is masculinity from a Muslim perspective, from an Islamic perspective, and what's the role of men, we will not get sustainable change. We will not get them on board to hear those messages and become those agents for change that we want them to be. You know, one of the really common pieces of feedback I was getting from young men in particular in the workshops was, you know, I knew my faith didn't accept or didn't allow this, but I didn't know how to say it. I didn't know what the principles were that gave me the proof to say it. So they were almost ashamed of being Muslim men because everybody was challenging them on what their religion said about violence. And in their heart, they knew it wasn't right, but they didn't know how to respond to it because of all the cultural overlays that they've collected over time. So helping them re-identify with their identity from a faith perspective helps us in stripping away those cultural layers and letting them see actually what their faith really says and giving them, I guess, the opportunity and the agency to for them themselves to rediscover and reassert who and what their identity really is, but in a way which allows them to then say, hang on, no, this is not right. Don't say that. Don't do that. Because they were scared to confront people within their circle on these issues that we all know contribute to violence, whether it's condoning, whether it's disrespect, all of those issues.
Let me throw to Britt because many of us were at the No to Violence conference a few weeks ago in Melbourne, and these themes of masculinities and male identity, that was a really big focus of the conference. It was a wonderful conference, by the way, so well done, NTV. But what for you, why is it important for the sector to take into account these male perceptions of identity? It came across at some of the presentations at the conference that this backlash that Ghaith just identified, that there was a very high percentage, more than a third, I think it was, of Australians, especially young men, who thought that women's rights had gone too far, and those sorts of views came across quite high in the research in Australia. So we are seeing this backlash. And so just over to you to talk about some of those points.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the really important things that I want to note is that we all have a role to play in disrupting the relationship between masculinity and violence. And I think that really being able to understand and communicate that gender equality benefits everyone. It isn't about taking something away from men. It's about benefiting everyone and having a future where we can all be safe. And I think that being cognizant of male perceptions of identity, it really influences the advocacy we do for policy change and program development. It really impacts the interventions we use with people who use violence, and the prevention work that we do with men and boys. And I think that understanding that there isn't just one idea of male identity, understanding it from a faith-based perspective, understanding it from a cultural perspective, and ensuring that we're not conflating culture and faith as well. I think that those are really crucial elements. And I think that this guide is a real important contribution to taking a truly intersectional approach when it comes to prevention and response. And I think a really huge part of that is recognizing the role of shame, and what that means for change and accountability, and what this means for safety as well.
Thanks, Britt. I'm just going to ask one more question and then I'll take some questions from the audience. Annabelle, you've worked in the sector, you've worked in government, you've worked as a lawyer. In your view, what's the role and responsibility of the sector and government in ensuring that communities are safe, and how can we all work together most effectively?
Look, I think there are times where the role of the sector and government is different, and I think there are times where I think we can collaborate. You know, government has a responsibility in spending public money to ensure probity, to do all of those checks and balance things that we need government to do. But what government can also do is work with the sector and empower the sector to do what we do best, which is working with our communities on the ground, with capacity building, with reaching out beyond the boundaries of our sector and engaging our community members to work together towards the Australia that we all want to see, which is one free from violence in a generation. And I think, you know, just on the previous point too, I think it's so important that that government underpins and supports the sector to do these capacity building projects and to bring people outside the traditional sector to this work and to build their understanding around this kind of things. We know the power that positive role modelling and that positive projects to empower communities has a fundamental difference. You know, we see that you can change the hearts and minds of men and boys in getting them involved in positive projects, in encouraging them to be upstanders within their communities and to take roles in leadership, in educating others and bringing others on board. And so anything that government and the sector can do to collaborate on those things will be changing this country for the long term. And that's why I think these kinds of frameworks that can, you know, be released into the wild and that other groups can use and take further and learn from and know that it is evidence-based and underpinned are so important in achieving those aims that we all want to see.
Thanks, Annabelle. I might throw that question to you, Nemat, for the last word before we take some questions from the audience.
Thank you so much. I've been such an honour to be part of this conversation. I think in terms of what we're sort of seeing around the research and the experiences that Ghaith also saw around male identity in this space, and when it's overlaid with some of those cultural and faith considerations as well, is what we're actually seeing is what I think we need to take quite a longer term and strategic approach for. We have shifted the dial around domestic and family violence being not okay. We've succeeded in showing that it's beyond physical violence, that there is coercive and controlling and other elements to this violence, and it's being identified. And what we're also doing is now trying to improve the prevention stream. But as we do that, we have to, while we work to stop it before it starts, we need to be prepared for the fact that people will seek help the more that they can identify until we get to the point that we're stopping it before it starts. So we need to be mindful collectively to make sure that we are working really strategically in the prevention and the response and recovery stage to make sure that it's not mismatched, so that we can actually make sure that the first response is the best response. And in doing so, we're building people's capacity to not engage in those types of behaviours and to be agents of change in their own right. So that's one component. The other thing that I would really like to say is that there are glass cliffs and there are glass ceilings, and there is structural and systemic discrimination that even we as an organisation that's been in this space for 40 years continues to experience. And that is part of our lived experience within the space and within the sector. And so I think that there's a lot in terms of reflective practice, in terms of innovation, to just moving away from traditional modes of operation and default ways of working, that we can hold our own selves accountable in the way that we work in the present and that we move forward. So I think that there's an opportunity to say, even though we are doing amazing work collectively in the space, we can always do better, and we need to be conscious of the own, the own challenges that we all experience in trying to amplify and elevate this important work.
Thank you, Nemat. Let me check if we've got any questions that have come in from the audience. I haven't seen any in the chat, but I understand that Feda was collating them. Yeah. Feda, do we have any questions from the audience?
I'm just posting them in the chat now.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay. What is the recommended way to implement the guide if we have been hesitant or unsure of how to be inclusive of faith in this space? It's a great question. I might start with Ghaith on that one.
I guess the first one is obviously have a read of it, right? The guide's not meant to be the be all and end all of this. We've actually developed as a separate to the guide itself is some training modules. So if anybody really does do a lot of work with Muslims or the Muslim community, I would really encourage you to explore the training. So there'll be training around the faith principles itself, so that you get a bit more understanding of those, but also around the engagement. So as a mainstream organisation who is dealing with Muslim clients or with Muslim communities, what are some of those principles that you could really bring into how you engage with that? So I guess my first thing is read the guide and then send us an email, give us a call, and we're happy to have a chat and support you in any way we can.
I think
Nemat, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think I might add to that as well. Like in terms of practice, sometimes we don't in trying to be culturally responsive, we don't want to culturally or faith-based way stereotype anybody. So but ways that we can do that is that we can also ask questions, be curious, engage with your clients around what's coming up for them in terms of their faith celebrations. A lot of the time, as Ghaith said, there is a sense of shame that has been experienced, and they won't share unless there are. So be curious and courageous, because it can actually be a time where we can utilize faith as a tool for empowerment in therapeutic practice. You can engage with clients in a way that provides them with spiritual activism that they can lean into. We talk a lot about, it's funny, well, it's not funny, it's just a bit ironic in how we talk about, the dynamics of DFV being, really about power and control. But what Islam actually brings for victim survivors is this sense of controlling what you can control and letting go of what you can't control, and that can be hugely empowering and therapeutic for victim survivors in that space as well. If you're working with women with children in their care, utilizing that role as a mother in Islam and what that looks like around empowering her to be empowered because of the needs of her children. These are all parts of some of the practice that we do in the space, and we can always help build the sector's capacity in how to do that better. So in the prevention space it looks one way, but then in the response and recovery space there's other things that service providers can do, and it's about really having that tool in their back pocket to recognize that it's a tool that it doesn't apply to everyone, but if you can put the ingredients in where it's needed, it's something that can cut across cultural, linguistic, and other divides.
Thanks, Nemat. Annabelle, let me turn to you. You are the chair of the Coercive Control Lived Experience Reference Group. There's a question in the chat. What is the right balance between listening to expertise and lived experience, if there is any?
That's a really, really excellent question, and I think one of the things that I'm always mindful of is that there's a huge overlap between sector and professional expertise and lived expertise, and And I think sometimes we can get very much in that binary mode of thinking, you know, it's one or the other. And certainly I know across the workforce in the domestic and family violence sector in New South Wales, there is a huge amount of lived expertise. And I think we need to recognise and honour the testimony of individual victim survivors. There is, you know, the balancing of that and the truth in those stories and the rightness in those stories and experiences of systems, which we need to listen deeply to. There is professional expertise that draws from the aggregate of having spoken to many victim survivors in the space. And I think what we always need to remember as well is that the domestic and family violence movement came from victim survivors in the first place. And therefore, it, you know, kind of adding it, thinking of it in terms of adding it back in as an ingredient is not really the right way to think about it. This is where it grew from and where it's built. So we need to remember that that victim survivors and their lived experience and the intersection of those experiences, whether that involves faith, culture, all of those elements are an incredibly important part of how we build those responses. And I would say that it is always a balancing of that direct lived expertise testimony with the professional expertise as well.
Yeah, great answer. Britt, did you have anything to add on that question about the balance between lived experience and professional expertise?
Yeah, I probably couldn't say exactly what the exact balance would be, but I think that we should always be using practice-based evidence and evidence-based practice and incorporating and embedding lived experience rather than using it as, I guess, a tack on. I think we find that lived experience is not often contradictory to the research and evidence that we use as well. So I think the marriage it's more of a marriage rather than a balance, I should say.
Thanks. I just see there's one more question that's just come in for Ghaith specifically. You mentioned the challenge in getting men to attend the workshops. How do you communicate best to men to get men to attend the session?
Good question. The way in which we went about the workshops is exactly the way I've got in the sector guide. We use that methodology for this very project because we ourselves are a mainstream organisation in a sense. And the last thing we wanted to do was to go in and impose our solutions on those local communities. And so what we did is we engaged with on-the-ground Muslim organisations who come from those communities, know those communities, and could draw into those communities. So, you know, the community in Darwin is very different to the community in Perth, which is different to Sydney and Melbourne. You know, we could have gone there and said, well, we think the answer is 1, 2, 3, but it makes no sense for a community up in Darwin, which is highly professional, as opposed to a community, say, in Perth, which has a very strong overseas student demographic to it. Sydney and Melbourne are 3rd, 4th generation communities. They're completely different. So the way in which we did it was we actually engaged with on-the-ground Muslim organisations and partnered with them. So we build capacity of those organisations for them to be able to continue the work in their communities. So that's part of why we had to, you know, why some workshops took a bit longer, because we had to find the right partner organisations who had reached into the communities. Now, we could have gone out there and just put out and gone directly, and we would have got people, but we wouldn't have got the right people. We wouldn't have got the people who actually needed to hear the message. And so I guess the answer is collaborate with the right organisations to get the outcome you're looking for.
Yeah, well said. So that's going to be our last question for the panel today. Thank you so much to our amazing 4 panellists. If we were all in the room today, I'd ask you to give them a round of applause, but we can give them a virtual round of applause. Thank you so much to everyone. I'll hand back over to Moo to take us through the rest of the agenda for today. Thanks again, everyone.